So I'm here with Daniel Garner of OG Rose and Aspasia Karageorge. That is the correct pronunciation. Which you can't. I said 4 names for Daniel. Do you know what I mean? It was like Daniel Garner of OG Rose. You can have 1.
Oh God! That's all it was in ancient times, you know.
Yeah, and my name's Tim. All right. So this was invited as a follow-on dialogue to a conversation that Daniel and I had probably about 4 months or so ago, I think, on cultural shamanism. Now, we covered a lot in that context, and to open into this conversation, I'd just like to draw into presence a very interesting and challenging and endlessly shifting question that goes something like, when should we make the unconscious conscious? You know, posed like that, you know, one doesn't all of a sudden want to become conscious of every activity in their body when they're like going into a roundabout driving a car, right? It's pretty good that we've automated a whole bunch of those processes so we can focus on just what we need to in order to get the right information in and make that correct choice. Now, the context I have more so in mind are social contexts where in principle there is an energy toward activity which feels relevant to engage with. Perhaps if this group of people decide to invest money in this area, or perhaps if they challenge this particular framework of seeing or onboard another, it could be tremendously influential in what a community or perhaps a culture ends up investing its resources in, how it comes to know itself and orient itself in relation to the future. And so in such contexts, it can be quite delicate what we make conscious. You know, maybe the food's not the best. Perhaps it's not that relevant to critique the food. Do you know what I mean? Why make that conscious? When is the revealing of a constraint that is modulating communication helpful, and when isn't it? Part of the reason why I'm asking these questions is because it's come up on many occasions over the years, doing the podcast, in plenty of other contexts, and then more recently in some podcasts that I haven't published. What was quite present for me was how challenging it was to invite awareness to pay attention to the present dynamics which were conditioning what the conversation was and could become. They weren't operating at the level of content that the conversation was in principle about. They were part of the context that was orienting the possibility for exchange. And when we attempt to make conscious, or at least point out what might be influencing whether or not we can even speak freely or more freely, in that sense of feeling capable of finishing a sentence, and when we're not choking up or finding ourselves confused midway through because we suddenly sense that if I say it like that in that way, maybe I won't be welcome here. Maybe someone will feel in some way ostracized and will become defensive. All manner of trigger points, yes. But also at the level of just straight up confusion. Is confusion welcome here? Is saying something that upturns or jostles or reveals a crack in some framework or map that was part of my identity in this context and strategic mooring. Now that it's unsettled, all of a sudden I don't feel so stable. Maybe I don't feel like a leader in this context, and so I definitely don't want that to happen. But what if that movement is between those two, or that group in conversation, from presencing more depth, relating with more depth? I think that's something like the tension here. And of course, there's many ways to locate ourselves in that context. Plenty of different instances and intuitive discernments around risk and reward. When is it okay to say the quiet part out loud? And who am I? Who are you? Who are we to be so confident that our choice about what to reveal is in fact in service of what we thought? These are all dynamics, I think, which are part of the cultural shamanic agency. It's part of cultural shamanic agency. And so I'm curious what comes up there. Maybe I'll pass it over to Daniel first. You mentioned before we started recording some interesting reflections you had around a conversation I had with Anderson Todd to do with, well, why relate with human beings at all when AI is now not so much on the periphery, but more and more so entering the core of how we might even want to sell therapy to each other, for instance. I'll pass it over to you.
Can I briefly jump in? Sorry to...
Please, Aspasia, please.
Very rude of me, but can I just first, I just want to throw in that also this question, though, assumes that we know how to make the unconscious conscious, that we have some particular process we're following to do that. And what is that? But please.
Well, if we stay with that, then that sense you had of, can I, interrupt or change the protocol here, right? That is an instance of that. And so that discerning process you had about whether it's welcome, what kind of influence onto the communication channel, I think is obviously a real sign there. And you're both nodding your heads, so I know you agree. But there's something about paying attention to the continuity of the communication that's possible, which is a key signal around the actual act of bringing in something that was, let's say, less conscious. Now, whether or not that doesn't give us all we need, but it's a key sign.
Yes. And yes, to me, those are different things. So that is my willingness to question, destabilize, challenge, all these other words you were using, my willingness to do that in this moment. That to me is different to making the unconscious conscious. But it's linked in that is the pathway through which we can start a process of making the unconscious conscious. So it's an integral part of it, which is why I then just threw out the question before Daniel starts, that I think it's important to also take into account that we are assuming that this can be done in some reliable manner. We can make the unconscious conscious in some reliable manner, which, felt important to me to add in. Yeah.
No, I think that's magnificent. And first, that ability to change the conversational dynamics also is tied to, as you were speaking with Anderson Todd about, is tied to a certain trust that people in the conversation are here for the unfolding of the thought. And it's totally fine to break dynamics or jump in. There's no sort of status games. There's no sort of a hierarchy in a business meeting or something that needs to be respected, because there's a genuine trust that people are here for the unfolding of the thought, the unfolding of the questions, and the possibility that is only afforded by the relationship being of a certain condition that makes things possibly come forth that otherwise could not be there. And when you get people who trust in that, then you're able to change things, change flows, do different things, and it actually is not going to move into egotism. It's not going to fall back onto people getting upset, which is usually what happens when you have more problematic dynamics in conversations that you never get beyond, right? And so I think Aspasia, there's a lot of brilliant points there, because I think that, so for me, that's exactly right. There's the question of how you bring the unconscious into the conscious. Then there's also this kind of question of what is the unconscious, right? What does it mean to refer to the unconscious? So, there's a few ways I relate to that. So first off, on the way that you were describing it, it just makes me think of that example I always use from Heidegger, right? Like most of the time, a doorknob is invisible. You use it without looking at it. Only when it breaks do you notice it, right? Like it was always there. Like much of our life is background. The majority of what we experience is background. And so in a sense, it is unconscious. It is that which we see, but we're not conscious of. So you have unconscious in that sense. And when it comes to relationship dynamics, it can be what are the assumptions, social dynamics, et cetera, so forth, that are in the background, that are framing the conversation, that people are unconscious of, that if you made them conscious would run the risk of breaking the conversational mechanism, because that frame makes the conversation possible. But if the conversation is somehow problematic, self-effacing, pathological, then you're not going to change that by simply moving within the structure. You have to bring the background structure forward to address that. But whenever you do that, you run the risk of destroying the entire relational possibility at all, right? Because people can't handle making the unconscious conscious, right? And so then, of course, there's the question of when should you take that risk? On what grounds would you have reason to think that you are right in your assessment of something needing to be made conscious? And then, of course, there are the methodologies by which one would do those things. So, for me, also, too, as we've talked about before, and I do think this is tied to a note, arguably, what else would be a cultural shamanism other than figuring out what to bring from the unconscious into the conscious, how to walk those things over? And it just, again, I think we talked about this last time. I always tie this extremely important question to Beatrice and Unveiling with Dante. If Beatrice smiles too much too soon, Dante is killed. But if she doesn't smile at all, Dante can't ascend. So there's some sort of skill here. Aristotle talked about this mean, this unveiling with the UN in parentheses. Basically, what I heard Mr. Todd saying with AI is we're just like, no, let me just not worry about this whole making the unconscious conscious. Because AI, I don't have to worry about this kind of question. I don't have to worry about the entire art of unveiling at all. I know it will support me. I know it won't bring anything from the background into the foreground that will be troubling. I won't be disturbed. Because, Todd was saying that a lot of people are going to AI because they don't want to be judged. I would say, actually, that's very true. Another side is people don't want to be, quote unquote, disturbed. People find themselves disturbed in conversation, both in a kind of you threw off my serenity and disturbed in a sort of existential, but also horrified. Like there's disturbed is something very problematic that people want to avoid, right? And so this question basically has been so difficult that instead of figure it out, like this question really does, in my opinion, frame, do we want to try to extend humanity or replace humanity? Are we going to bother with the human anymore? Well, if we're going to bother with the human, then this is the kind of question, this is at the heart of it, learning the art of unveiling, learning how to bring things in background into foreground. And if we just go to AI, we're basically saying the question can't be answered. It's too hard. It's too random. Sometimes it's okay. Other times it's not. I don't even want to think about it. I don't even know where to begin. So I'll just go to AI. And it makes me think of, because I'll make an anime reference here, Neon Genesis Evangelion, which I love this metaphoric example. Basically, the character in that is this question of, am I going to learn to relate to human beings, or am I just going to figure out how to tear down the boundaries between bodies that they refer to as AT fields and call it the third impact? So I don't have to worry about difference anymore. We'll just have this primordial oneness is basically the temptation. It's kind of about transhumanism, a certain form of transhumanism way before transhumanism in 1998. It's like the problem of people having other bodies, as Benjamin Studebaker said, it's too hard. So let's just become a kind of return to a certain cosmic oneness and figure out how to do scientific experiments by which to do that. Because if you do that, you're basically saying we're not going to have to figure out things like the show talks about hedgehog dilemmas. It talks about the Thanos drive. It's all these kind of psychoanalytical terms, and it's basically exploring all of those, and it's just too hard to think. So forget about it. Let's just figure out how to remove AT fields, differences in human bodies, and bring everyone together. And weirdly, I think that show is actually basically still is actually what's being played around with today. So, if the algorithm likes anime references, here we go. So that's good. But it's actually, I think too, it's just very easy to be like, people are too painful. People are too hard. It's too hard to relate. Why would I even bother with that? And also too, when you ask a question like, how do we make the unconscious conscious? That almost seems to scream at the rationality of not trying, because it just seems like, how would you even begin answering that question? Let's just figure out how to, remove AT fields or all be a sort of primordial oneness. But I'll pass it on. But the first things that do come to mind is I do think there are kind of ideas in some religions on if in a conversation there's a certain entrapment, people feel entrapped. If there's a feeling of energy drain, if there are patterns that keep being repeated, I can say more. That tends to be evidence that there's something unconscious that needs to be conscious, because there's a certain stuckness that occurs. There's obviously symptoms that you see. And then when it gets to questions of how, I think this gets into things like the role of analogy. Jesus uses parables. It also depends if someone is open to receiving the unconscious, then you can give them a direct teaching. If not, you give them a parable they have to wrestle with. I think this gets into the arts. I think it gets into the skill of pointing at something without making it too direct, but pointing just enough that it directs their curiosity to take agency in the exploration, but not so much that they feel like you're pouring something down their throat or you're forcing something upon them. So there's some sort of artfulness that I think some religious traditions have in this kind of artfulness, but those are some opening thoughts.
What it sounds to me like we're talking about here is that going to AI helps people to avoid the emotional experience of human relationships. And I think, that's what sits at the heart of all of this. Is the purpose of relationship and conversation to go beyond oneself, or do you already know everything? So then what's the point in talking to anyone? And so for me, relationship, it's necessary that there is some level of challenge involved. Now, the settings of that and how we go about doing all that's obviously very important. You don't just want to be constantly bombarded with challenge when you're with your partner, but otherwise, what's the point? If you just want to stagnate and sort of marinate in your own current understanding of things, you don't just do that. To me, it's the draw of relationship and the gift of it is that you can go beyond yourself as you currently are now. But in order to do that, you have to be open to the fact that that requires some level of challenge and being open to letting something new in. And to do that, because we are human and just because of the way we are wired, leads to emotional response within us. It is painful to be challenged. It can make us angry. It can touch on grief. It can touch on guilt to have something pointed out to us that we didn't understand the impact of, or maybe we did and we still did it, and have that reflected back to us. All of these emotions are difficult. They are difficult to get in touch with. And most of what sits in the unconscious, from my point of view, are memories and emotions. And we are highly motivated to stay away from certain emotions. And so what we're avoiding, from my point of view, what we're avoiding in relationships, and why we probably turn to AI, is the discomfort, is the in that moment, those moments of small challenge or questioning or destabilizing, it touches the tip of one of these emotions, and we don't want that. And our anxiety starts to go through the roof, because that's an alarm bell, because the anxiety is in response to the feeling. It's a feeling phobia. It's an emotion phobia. So now we're either really anxious, or if we're not anxious, if our ego is structured in such a way that we actually have a whole set of defenses that don't even let us get to anxiety, we're just right back and we double down. We go into our cognitive defense. Well, they're not all cognitive. We go into our defenses, which means that we're not anxious, because they're defenses against anxiety. So we're not anxious. We just sit in either minimizing, discounting this person. There's a whole range of them. Over intellectualizing, of like just withdrawing, leaving the situation. There's a million of them. I can't think of them now, of course. But we go into defenses, which just serves for the wall to go up. Now we are absolutely not open to anything getting in, and that's how they operate. The second that for whatever reason in that relationship, those defenses start to crack because they're no longer holding, then we get very anxious, and then we're highly motivated to get out of the situation. or we start to act in very impulsive ways that are not of our best selves and not how we would otherwise act. And these are disconnecting or hurtful, and then they come with a whole range of relational consequences. So the reason, I guess one way of thinking about it is to relate to another person requires an ability to have some openness to discomfort. And there's just a whole range of ways that we are more and more resistant to experiencing any kind of discomfort, especially in a relationship where we believe we're supposed to always feel like all these words. I know they're well-meaning and I sort of know what they're pointing to, but I think they're misused and misunderstood. We're supposed to feel safe and we're supposed to feel calm and we're supposed to feel nurtured and supported and accepted. And these are all words that actually have quite nuanced meanings, I think, that aren't being grappled with. And they just become, I guess they become memes. It's just, and it becomes more resistance. It's like, oh, I'm no longer going to be your friend because I don't feel safe. I don't feel seen or heard, or all these words. Everything is oversimplified. And so we have the answer around how we start to work towards making the unconscious conscious, how we would even start to point this pattern out to a person, that you realize when you're engaging with this friend or your partner or in this group, that the way you are behaving in this conversation may actually not be driven by what you think it's being driven by. It's probably 90% driven by an unconscious process that just wants to keep you away from feeling that feeling. And all these things that you're doing and the way you're dismissing this person and discounting that one, and the way that you are falling at this person's feet and overvaluing them, and only feeling positive feelings towards them, like all these different things are examples of an unconscious process at play that is solely motivated in keeping you from having this feeling. It's nothing, it's blurring your ability to let in what you could otherwise let in. It is keeping you stuck in a corner. You are closed to all the possibility that sits here in this moment before you. And you are seeing people around you in a very reduced manner, because it has to work with the defensive structure that's at play. So when I talk about making the unconscious conscious, I'm talking about, I guess, trying to help a person even see that could be what's happening. That the way they're interacting here is not really solely them choosing it. There's all these other things that are at play. Do they want to do something about it? Is it having enough consequence in their life that they want to do something about it? And then you have to really increase the pressure and build up the intrapsychic crisis. And there's a series of things to do. But ultimately, the hook is trying to get them to finally allow themselves to touch that emotion that everything inside them is trying to keep them away from, and to bring it up in its fullest extent. And then this leads on to the action impulse, which I won't bore you with again. But that would be the process. But to do that, you first have to even get buy-in from a person that this might be happening. And that's really challenging. It's really the front end of the work that is really challenging. Yeah, I think that the questioning and the saying things that might upset the agreement that's going on in a group is necessary if you want, I guess it's growth, or you want more than just what currently is. And I guess that's the appeal of AI, is that people can just get it to treat them however they want. They just program it in. And I do think there's something to be said for the fact that people always know it's not a human. So I don't think it's doing the same thing to their physiology. They know that this is not a human they're interacting with. And I do think that changes something as well. And so they are maybe learning more declarative facts about the world. Some of them accurate, some of them not. Or, there's ways that it's helpful, but they are not learning anything about how to be with their emotions in the presence of another human being, and how another human being can impact their emotional state. And then our ability to bear that and not have that be something that becomes a barrier, or that we need to resist the other person. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. One thing I would add is the angle that recognizes the tenuousness of our context of belonging, the tenuousness of the belonging we might feel in our relational contexts at different levels. This has always been, for me, the clearest way I frame such notions as meta crisis and really meaning crisis as well. Really a breakdown in the context of belonging in terms of our capacity to know how and teach each other how to contribute to strengthen and support and rebuild our context of belonging, and expanding that out and looking through that prism across multiple levels, from systems right through into the family, I do think is quite revealing. I also think that we live in a context that, because of the breakdown of so many community structures and so much more pressure put on the family, and then in recent decades and perhaps century, the pressure put on, for instance, romantic love and partnerships, in a way that so many tensions and needs are funneled through those relationships, to the degree that if one were to open into what might be stressing that relationship at one level, then up for dislodgement would be all these other aspects of one's belonging in context as well. Now, of course, we see this in all different forms of cultural contexts, including the religious context of, say, Muslims, for instance. I'm sure many Christian contexts too, where the notion of divorce or the break of a core partnership, in the same way that breaking from the religion, of course you get this with Mormons too, breaking from the religion would be met with real profound resistance by the other members of the community. And so, well, perhaps it's not possible to speak about what appears unconscious to other members of the community who might know about some instance of, whether, you know, violence or disharmony or whatever happening in a particular family. Well, how often, you know, the phrase, you know, sort of suffering in silence and all these sorts of things. And we get them in all manner of communities and cultures. So there's a sort of a few points wrapped up in there. I do think that what adds further complication to the prospect of making the unconscious conscious are those sociological community relations, or lack thereof, because the consequence for stepping into the tension could just be so high. The other direction I would just point to would be to sort of affirm something you said toward the end there, Aspasia, when you said most, you know, the hardest part is on the front end in terms of initiating the interaction. In the same way I often say on the podcast and the network, most of the magic of a conversation happens before the conversation itself sort of points to a similar thing. So at that level of intention and setting, but I think this notion as well is really important, just to welcome back in the context of the digital age and these various mediums that we interact through. But you could also look at what it is to approach someone in a, whether a church context or a work context or a play context, these different constraints influencing that particular medium of communication. I do think we can see the process of making the unconscious conscious, or observing what constraints can be modulated in this relationship so as to afford coming into depth and orienting possibility one way or another, which involves kind of leaning perhaps on some tension here so we can make that turn or something. That's something I'm often thinking about. I would say one of the hardest challenges of all is actually the cold email. The cold email is almost impossible. The thing I really resist is the incredible amount of gamification and game playing of engineering how to open someone up to possibility. And yet many of our mediums for communication currently, whether digital or in person, I think are permeated with the game theory that pushes us toward thinking of others as objects to influence and manipulate, even if just to get into some context where the work or some deep work might be possible. Because of just how difficult it is for people to open up into real contexts of intimacy and trust these days. And because of perhaps how fragile our contexts of belonging are. So without going on to link all of those together, I do this is is how I relate to the context.
Brilliant. Well, both of you said it's brilliant. Basically, we changed our sociological condition away from givens to increase freedom, which means that we have to do everything Aspasia is saying still, and we made it harder. And we weren't ready to do that greater difficulty. So to what you're saying, following Berger and all the people I talk about, when you have sociological givens, then you feel more security to actually explore maybe more difficult subjects because you know these people aren't going to leave you, your community's still going to be there, you're not, there's going to be some givenness to your economic and social condition. Where now the boss will just fire you. They don't go to the same church as you. They don't know your family. They have no commitment. You also feel like people's families break apart quickly. You feel much more precarious. Cadell has talked about the precarious class, right? Well, why did we end up in those conditions? Because we increased individual freedom. That's why. We removed the constraints that limited individual expression and freedom to create individual opportunity, but in so doing, created this precariousness of which you still have to do the stuff Aspasia is saying, though. It's not going to get better if you don't do it. And yet that precariousness is still just as real as you were saying. This is the extraordinary difficulty of our moment. And it's why AI is so appealing, because AI seems to be a way out of the problem. Well, AI won't judge me. AI won't make me face these things, and I'll feel relationship. That's what, well, look, I already referenced anime. I've always been of the opinion that basically Japan is where the entire West is going to go and is the trajectory of the West after the quote unquote death of God. And if you look at the TV shows and the kind of books, it's all about human relations of AI, becoming robot, rather be ghosts in the cell. They've been thinking these questions for a very, very long time. And it is extremely clear that if we don't learn some sort of artfulness of being human, then it's just you're just going to go. AI basically does win as what humans relate to. Humans, there can be this assumption that, well, humans will never relate with AI in some sort of deep, erotic or sexual way or whatever like that. No, humans libido is very, very, very flexible, and we will certainly flex it in whatever direction we need to avoid pain. However much and if we don't feel like we have the security or the support to face that pain, we have no issue at all falling in love with anything that we need to. But of course, this suggests falling in love and being in love and the beauty that moves the sun, the stars and sun might be different things. So we also have to become more sophisticated in what it means to talk about the highest things like love. I think also what is being suggested is that the unconscious is basically running most people's lives. There is something unconscious that is running your life. Most people's lives are run by background, right? But the challenge is that if you're going to not have the unconscious run the show, then you need to be ready to run the show, quote unquote. which means you have to learn not in a power dynamic, in a relational human dynamic. You've got to know how to run the show. It's like the French, everyone talks about the French Revolution. You throw out a corrupt government, but if you're not ready to replace it with something, it can make things worse, right? This is this problem. And it's just very critical. Following, Tocqueville and Hannah Arendt and all these different people, the French Revolution was completely justified. These were corrupt institutions. They were abusing people. It's not like the French Revolution was a bunch of peasants who were wrong. They were very justified. The problem is that even if you overturn something and you're right to overturn it, if you're not ready to replace it with something, things can be worse. It's like Jesus saying, if you remove one demon, be sure to replace it with something, or 7 more will come. Basically suggesting it would be better to keep the one demon than remove it without being prepared to put something in its place. It actually makes things a whole lot worse. So given that gamble, we basically most of the time almost done just kind of the rational safe bet, which is we'll just leave let the unconscious run the show. It's safer. Why take the risk of removing it and risking 7 demons showing up, or the unleash of the death drive that Burke associates with the sublime. Edmund Burke writes on the French Revolution. We've just said it's too dangerous. Let's keep all this. Let's not do what Aspasia is saying. Let's keep these things in the background because it's too dangerous. It's too dangerous. And true, it is dangerous. But the only things in life worth doing require danger. But you have to believe that there are higher forms of life, and this is very important. If you don't believe there are higher possibilities of life, then why would you take the risk? Because you see no possibility of something better on the other side, right? So, for example, if your entire life, every relationship has been run by the unconscious, you've never actually experienced a relationship of play and dynamics and beauty and all these different things, why would you think there is another alternative, right? If you've never seen it modeled. And this is why models and having conversations like this online where people can see those, that's why these things can be very, very important. Because if people don't even have never even seen or don't even have the idea of different ways that people would relate, then the idea of making the unconscious conscious and all the risk that would take, it would be a risk with no upside. Why would you do it, right? Oh, and if also, as I will get into, although I may pass it first because this would be another leg of the discussion, if you don't have a society that believes in beauty, like that, this higher beauty experience, well, then what's the upside of doing this, right? What is the upside? Because there's also something to be said that I'd have to elaborate on, is that the unconscious that you need to bring forth. Also, I think there's a layered question to it. And if I use just the 3 infinites, there's the unconscious you need to make conscious that's keeping you from the truth. There's the unconscious you need to make conscious that's keeping you from the good. And then there's the unconscious you need to make conscious that's keeping you from the beautiful. And like a lot of the things that are the particular arts and practices to get toward the good, which you could maybe associate with, are different than the ones to get to the true, which might be like mental model, Dunning-Kruger effects and different things like that. And those are different from the beautiful. And we are basically, and here's the issue in my opinion, we are at the particular historical moment where we have to learn to make the unconscious of all 3 of those conscious to not make AI a better bet than the human, right? Like because the AI you experience as true, it tells you the facts, it gives you all the information. You experience it as good when it doesn't judge you and it's pleasurable and it gives you infinite gratification in different things. But can it give you beauty? And what exactly is beauty? And what is the experience there? If we don't believe, and this would have to be expanded, and we will, if we don't believe there is a particular kind of experience that can only be afforded by a particular quality of human interaction, which entails a certain bravery in the ways that Aspasia is saying, especially in conditions of the precarious class, as you're pointing to, Tim. If we don't believe there's a possibility there that is not possible anywhere else, then it's just simply rational not to take the risk. Why would you do it? Why would you bother? It's just what Tim. It's just what you were talking about. Why would you bother? It would be rational just to stay with the AI. It would be rational just to let the unconscious run the show. People have to buy in that there is something missing. And on the question of buy-in, I think Aspasia is completely correct that the initial buy-in is very difficult. First, one can look at someone like a Ray Dalio in the book Principles. He's really big on radical transparency. Like everyone just says what they're feeling. They don't hide anything. And he claims that the success of Bridgewater is strongly tied to radical transparency. The people speak in the way Aspasia was saying. Now, the book Principles, I do think is fascinating, But the key there is that the buy-in is part of the structure. Like it's designed into the structure. So if you join the business, you know the architecture. So you get the buy-in through the architecture. A second way in religions is you get people to buy in through devastation. Like if everything falls apart because they didn't change or they weren't willing to be vulnerable, then they can be willing to buy in. You could even talk about, these great forcing functions that can have an impact. Another one is, of course, beauty. If people have a beatific experience or an experience of beauty that says to them that there is a higher quality of life possible, and then you suddenly go back to your daily life and don't access that, but you know it's possible, then you know there must be something in the background keeping you from that, right? There must be something in the way. Like if people have mystical visions, psychedelic experiences, truly profound quality of experiences, well, then you know this is possible. This is possible. So if it's not happening, you have reason to think there are things unconscious that are not being brought forth that are keeping those experiences. So that gives you a buy-in as well. There are many more things to say, but I will pass it here. Buy-ins can also come from friendships. Buy-ins can also come from believing life is unknown and thus a mystery to explore versus unknowable. Buy-ins can also come when people they've done vulnerability and see it pay off. That makes them also, they create habits of buying in as well. All of these have to be expanded on, but I'll pass it for now.
How much do the buy-ins you just mentioned require the strength or agency and perhaps positioning to be seen? When it comes to architecture, when it comes to beauty, I'm not quite sure how to phrase the one where you were mentioning the church. You kind of perhaps summed it up as a forcing function. I'm wondering if that was connoting to these kind of like invitations to the good, if you were following it around the three concepts of the good, true, and beautiful, where perhaps beauty, obviously beauty in architecture, perhaps truth, and so the other one pointing toward the good, and that would seem to perhaps look toward a pre-existing relational context that was kind of capable of inviting a kind of warmth of normative participation relationally, something like that. I'm definitely not trying to reduce what you're saying. I think that there's an affect as well as a real systemic reality of alienation, which is just something I want to bring into the kind of the context of response here. I find that when I am in the position to be heard or seen, and by seen I do mean something at least with the kind of attention that is kind of on board with investing a little bit of that deepening. Of course, when you meet someone, you have that opportunity, right? And meeting that moment to initiate and catalyze that possibility is, of course, a kind of artfulness, and it isn't to be done all the time. But there's a inherent power asymmetry in the context of attentionalism, in the context of capitalism, and these are often some of the key hidden or unconscious constraints, depending on the context, that I'm often really drawn to draw out, because it seems as though they are conditioning the possibility to make the kind of choices which could influence the architecture, which could open the possibility to share one's art or presence or point towards something that might be beautiful, to spend the time and invest the energy in cultivating a friendship. Of course, we meet our own context where we are, but there is something about this cultural shamanism frame which is looking to continue to relate with the bigger picture shifts and dynamics which are shaping the territory. And what I find, and this is something I've been trying to mention in the hallways in between stages to people I'm often perhaps just meeting who I think might not be factoring in this as much as would be helpful for the integrity of the conversation that's being broadcast, is just how much, again, attentionalism and resources and status and a whole bunch of stuff are mediating the very possibility to be seen. And what if those mediators of what gain the resources and gain attention are in fact not necessarily those which increase the capacity to share the kind of signal toward deepening and relationality that we're pointing towards here. Those would seem to be ones that would be very important to bring into attention if they were in fact unconscious, right?
Yes. Not to jump back in. Very much so. And then there are the questions of how one would do that and what exactly does that look like, and so on and so forth. So there's a kind of idea in the metaphysics or theology of Christianity that sin has no substance, which means that whatever being it has is it's more like a parasite, really. So it eventually will eat itself. It eventually runs out as long as you don't keep giving it substance, really. And usually what ends up happening is the reason why sin can gain so much power is because, quote unquote, good people are giving them substance by giving it something good. So like the idea of like a St. Augustine or someone is that, there's nothing wrong with sex, but lust is a disordered relation to sex. There's nothing wrong with food, but gluttony is a disordered relationship with gluttony. Therefore, all quote unquote evils are disordered relationships. It doesn't actually have any substance. And the key then to having evil be defeated is not by really fighting it, but leaving it to its own devices to eat itself. Because eventually the disorder will dissipate because there's no substance there to support it, right? So you simply have to resist the appeal of lust, resist the appeal of gluttony. And if you can do that, well, then gluttony can't create itself because it's a disordered relationship with food, right? So if you learn to have the right relationship with food, right relationship with sex, then these bad disorders can't be created out of nature, if you will. They can't spontaneously arise on their own. They come from how humans choose to participate in them, right? Also, too, the argument of a St. Augustine and many more Christian theologians is all of these things basically lead to death. They lead to destruction. It's not that gluttony... The problem with gluttony is that it will destroy you. It's not simply like arbitrarily that God was like, I don't like gluttony, therefore gluttony is bad. It's like, no, gluttony destroys you. You actually come to dislike yourself. You feel powerless over your own appetites. It leads to a lower quality of life that you experience. Now, you can cross a certain event horizon called damnation, where you lose the capacity to even know that it's bad, right? You can't tell the difference anymore. Your hell is locked from the inside, as Lewis said. And that would be a kind of point where you're quote unquote lost, right? But you're not lost because one day someone arbitrarily said, I don't like you. So, God's like, you're lost, whatever, right? It's the inevitable end of where the logic of disordered and sin leads. It eventually leads past a point where you are locked in on your side, right? Well, if this is all so, and something that you detect as a background is in fact something that needs to be made conscious, then there are two operating notions. First, those of whom are unwilling to make it conscious and to do that work will eventually suffer autocannibalism, devour themselves, and that form of culture will not sustain itself, right? If it is truly the case that there is something problematic about attentionalism, versus us just think there's something problematic about attentionalism, then time will tell, right? Time will actually bring that forth and it will devour itself. And this is where many then sort of Christian ministries and ideas are like, well, then we just have to we have to sustain ourselves. We have to actually kind of house the light so that that work of self-destruction actually occurs, right? Please, Tim.
Could I ask, that's brilliant, Daniel, could I ask you to also respond to this? In the case where, and this would be the, core argument behind the whole sort of meta crisis space, that power of one paradigm, the power of an emergent paradigm, take nuclear weapons as an example, can be so great that in its process of self-destructing or auto-cannibalizing, as you say, renders the possibility for any other context of belonging which might have been attempting to create their own membranes and boundaries are actually, they just simply cannot do that because the power is too overwhelming, at which point, well, how to relate to that in a more active, modulating way, right? The options on the table are framings like war. Many people argue we are already part of a fifth generational warfare context in which, in fact, the way we are interacting now might be said to attempt to convey an alternative, or perhaps share the kind of presence that can defend against some of the attacks on the digital psychological context of propaganda and alienation and confusion that is propagated. But the question would be how else to frame the context. Is that challenge I've just made, that inclusion I've just made, valid? And what alternatives are there? I actually want to be careful how I pose this. I could pose it too basically and say what alternatives are there to war, but I feel the part of me that's asking that is asking it from a deeper place than that question conveys. But without spending the time to do that, I'll open it up to you to reframe this how you want. But certainly that challenge of the outsized influence of an emergent new paradigm's potential to destroy the capacity for a broader transcontextual context of belonging, and how might we relate to that?
I think, not to jump in again, but on that excellent question. So, if nuclear bombs can go off and kill us all, at what sense does evil auto-cannibalize itself, et cetera, so forth, right? And then the question would be, how does one relate to that topic? And one can go on in different things. Well, so there's a few things. There's one, the idea of, even if at any moment a nuclear bomb could go off and kill us all, would an alternative cultural strategy work? Of directly petitioning, like doing something revolutionary, or trying to do some sort of very active political action, et cetera, so forth, right? And what does the historic record show on these things to stop these things? What political efforts seem to bring about great cultural change? Like, there are different questions of how to change the world that can also be asked, right? Like, how can you convince people not to use nukes or not use AI technology to brainwash people, et cetera, so forth, right? So that's what I'm hearing with the question on those kind of ways to approach those bigger topics. Is that a fair way to take the question, Mr. Adalin?
Yeah, give me 10 seconds or 20 seconds to just tune into that. Yes, I suppose what I'm driving towards has got to make sure to include the different modes and different ways we can approach boundaries and membranes, given that the auto-cannibalization of some cells can be so powerful that there is no safety. Therefore, we must stay in relation. Going to war, naively understood, might, if improperly held, just be part of those auto-cannibalizing dynamics. This is why notions like magic, love, spirit, a whole range of modes of influence which are not perhaps appropriately understood through the language of causation. I say perhaps just to offer a little bit of openness, as there's quite a lot in there. Thinking influence beyond causation was the sentence I began that last podcast with Anderson, and I do think this is very relevant. Hopefully that clarifies a little bit.
Yes, sir. I appreciate that. So there's also, in some respects, I want to almost say empirical questions of what was the personality state. Well, they're not really empirical, but evidential-based assessments of what was the character of the leaders or people that made the decisions to lead or that were in the midst of things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, World War II, all of these different things, the American Civil War, the English Civil War, and so on and so forth, these big sort of events, right? Because even though nuclear bombs are a more severe technology, the same kind of human subjects are behind each one of those, even if the intensity is of the same scale. Well, when I read Gambling with Armageddon on the Cuban Missile Crisis, I would say a lot of underdeveloped egos of military generals from the Pentagon who were unwilling to say difficult things, like Aspasia was saying, got us this close to the apocalypse. Had they actually been able to do what Aspasia was saying, then we wouldn't have been this close to the apocalypse. And basically, we were this close to the apocalypse and didn't cross it because Kennedy did something that was, you would say, emotionally mature. And he just happened to be president. He asked the following question. All the military generals were like, how do we respond to the missiles? And Kennedy asked, why would Khrushchev do this? He wanted to know the motives of Khrushchev, where the military generals just wanted to ask, how do we respond, right? You could easily argue that that alone saved the world, an emotionally mature question that was asked when it mattered, right? And no amount, now again, you would want to have to go through all history and all these different case studies. It is often what has made a very large difference is at critical moments of history, whether there was or there wasn't emotionally mature people at the right place, at the right time, or not. And that has been a constant in human history. And you cannot get around this. It does not seem as if there's basically anything else that can do the same amount of effectiveness of having a big impact on history than the right emotionally mature people at the right place in the right time. And if that's the case, then whatever work increases the probability of the average person having those capacities, because we don't know who will be in those positions at that time, thus becomes a very important work to increase the probability of those events going the better way versus the worse way, right? And this is where studying all these biographies and historical accounts are very, very important. Now, the second thing that does seem to make a very big difference and change laws, the second thing that seems to do it is when governments make massive mistakes and then they have to correct course, okay? That's the devastation direction. Based on the examples of the nukes, that's not an option here, right? Like there is no course correction, right? So another way that governments correct is screwing up and being forced to, or political calculus, et cetera, so forth. Scandal, they're caught in scandal. One can go on. That's off the table if we're talking apocalypse or something. So the third way that seems to make a very big difference is the ability of people to change the quote-unquote social imagination. which is where you're able to make people imagine, as Hannah More did with African Americans and ending the slave trade in Europe, is like, I have an idea for you. Imagine that the black man is a human being. Imagine that. That may sound ridiculous, but that was actually hard to imagine for many people who had been conditioned and sociologically attuned to actually not be able to imagine that, right? And so Hannah More's big idea is that if you change the social imagination, that changes what is possible to people, and then they vote differently, they rule differently, the kind of society they want is different, right? So she put a whole lot of emphasis on cultivating social imagination, imagining what is possible by learning to see people and see the world in different ways. So a lot in literature, a lot of arts, and so on and so forth. And she also modeled that, right? So changing social imagination. Well, here's the other thing. Social imagination is also something one gains training in through emotional maturity, learning how to relate, stepping back, pauses, deeper psychological inner resources. I know Lena Anderson and Tomas will talk about the Nordic Bildung in the school system, 1850s to 1950s. This all seems very important. So I do not see a lot of evidence to show, basically, that anything but that is going to be your best address for increasing the probability at key moments in history where key decisions are made, that the people that are there are going to make the decisions that get us this side versus that side. And if you go, well, I don't really like that gamble, I don't really like that bet, well, then often people will fall into French Revolution mistakes or revolutionary activity. And it's just like Studebaker says, and history does show this. The state always has a operation to absorb the revolution into its system. It makes the revolutionary activity actually support it, right? There are Che t-shirts, or revolutionary material becomes very popular in intention. Like being mad at government is something government is very good at using to their service, right? So you all have these kind of absorbing mechanisms that get into it. But that all said, there is, to go back to some of the religious, and I'll stop, although there's way more to say. There's also, of course, in religions, the tradition of martyrdom, right? Which is the idea that if you really believe, the martyr is basically shining with their joy, shining with their light, and they believe that if they are killed or destroyed by the system, or they go bang, or they are taken down, that by the blood of the martyr, that actually has a massive cultural impact on the society, right? That actually changes people, right? And the willingness to be martyred, or the willingness to die while doing what you believe is right, is the necessary precondition to sustain yourself long enough for, if there's an auto-cannibalistic possibility to run its course and destroy the evil, quote unquote, that the only way you're going to get through that is that if you're actually willing to take it to the place of death. Now, there's a danger to that, and then I'll pass it to you, because then you can moralize difficulty and sort of become a sort of suffering servant, and you come to enjoy your suffering, and it becomes egotistical and sort of Lacanian. But this is where, for me, this is where beauty is very important, because if you were to ask me, so I genuinely believe that basically things like the meta crisis, which as Bologna again talks about, basically have to be addressed by spreading, not scaling, because there's a key distinction between spread and scale. You have to spread certain modes of subjectivity that increases the probability that people are able to do what Aspasia is saying, or have the psychological fortitude to make the decision when they matter. And there's a whole lot more to this. There are, I think, very practical reforms you can make in schooling. I think there are actual very practical things that can be done to change the architecture of the society that increase the probability of habits that are able to do what needs to be done. But that all has to be gotten into. But as one does all of those things, which is, say, participating in conversations like this, in creating these sort of new social imaginations and different things like that, I personally would not do anything differently. If a nuke were to go off in 5 seconds and that was it, game over, I would not do anything differently, because this has indeed helped me learn how to relate to human beings, to bring out that depth that I know AI will never give me, that in learning these skills and doing this actually brings a greater depth to individual life and to different relationships and to contexts. And at the same time, I believe it is the condition of subjectivity that has to spread to, in fact, afford the possibilities of dealing with the meta crisis. So you're getting it on both at the same time. Therefore, it's not I'm the savior or something, because once you develop a savior mentality, that becomes idolatry. But you see the potential of spreading a mode of being that can help people face the human
Right.
being and extend it while simultaneously living a life that you would live no other way. And I think that is kind of the secret of the martyr, actually, is that in many religious contexts, there's a joy. It was the joy before him that set him on the cross. It's the eye of the joy. It's the eye of these things. It's like, yes, at any moment a nuke could go off. At any moment there could be a solar flare. At any moment you could have the electric grid go down. All of these things could occur at any moment, and then the gig is up. But I wouldn't change anything, and I think that's important to think.
Yeah.
Because if you wouldn't change anything, then there's reason to think that spreading that to other people would spread something that they wouldn't change any also, and that can spread and actually start making shifts in how people live their lives.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautifully said. Thank you, Daniel. Now, Aspasia, I am going to do a tiny bit of synthesis and then ask you a question, because I feel that it's definitely your movement to take this next. So obviously Daniel shared a lot there. One way to synthesize some of the core of it is emphasizing the importance as a response of spreading the emotional maturity that can be with the question, that can ask questions, that can be with the tension of them. Gave the example of JFK and what have you. I think that's a very, very, very poignant example. Now, in presencing martyrdom, this would, among other things, suggest a righteous confidence, and let's say can be an appropriate confidence in a particular disposition around a question. It could be there is a kind of a deep injustice to some authority or leadership context, which must be resisted. In that sense, there's a stepping forward. And the question becomes, in a sense, to that last point, if in the review of our lives, in reckoning with the reality of its ending by whatever cause, have we stepped into and stepped up to life? So that's important. But there would be distinctions, important psychological, spiritual, psychoanalytic distinctions as to whether one was cultivating that emotional maturity to be with the presencing or making conscious the unconscious, in that sense, being with the question, versus the kind of dynamics of inflation, perhaps the kind of too quick affirmation and resolution of that tension. And part of what Daniel's saying here is that there is a valid mode of response which is going to look to some as though it were inflation. And of course, we see in many very intense theaters of war, religious conflict and what have you, martyrdom is, as a term, most known in the context of people blowing themselves up for their cause. Not only, of course, but it's certainly present. So what is it then, or perhaps not what is it then, but on this question of how you navigate and what does real emotional maturity look like? What's the landscape of that? What are the, maybe not risks, but the way that in maybe trying to become more emotionally mature or trying to bring forward some truth, we might overdo it and sort of squeeze too tightly. Daniel, it looked like you wanted to add something in there as a...
Well, just very quickly, martyrdom cannot be a goal. You can't say, I want to be a martyr. And you can't say, martyrdom is simply the possibility of there being a thing that will not auto-cannibalistically eat itself in your lifetime, that thus can, like the Roman Empire, right? Like if you say, I'm going to be a martyr, well, that tends to be egotistical and lead to all sorts of problems, right? Like it's just very important that if you worry about, okay, there are these things that if I sustain, I make this absolute choice. I really do believe attentionalism is problematic. I believe the Voicecraft alternative has substance where attentionalism is not, but I don't know that. Maybe there's something to an attentionalism that's good that I'm not there, but I'm going to make my choice based on what I've seen. I'm going to commit to the Voicecraft alternative, and I'm going to sustain myself in that activity. And if it is theoretically possible that the algorithm is so powerful that people will not see Voicecraft because it will always just direct them toward attentionalism, and therefore it won't have that modeling to spread. I know that's a possibility, and yet I'm nevertheless going to face that possibility because I believe in what is being afforded here. And if that ultimately leads to a quote unquote martyrdom, so be it. That's not the goal. The goal is actually the spread. But if that were to occur, so be it. That's the point of the courage that is necessary to actually sustain you. And if there is a joy that is found in the relationships, in the Voicecraft, that becomes evidence that there's actually reason to think that the substance is here and not there, that is in fact auto-cannibalistic, especially when you will know them by their fruits. What does it do to people? What do you see to people? What happens to people who succeed in the attentionalist economy? They can be psychologically devastated. It can be ruinous to them. They can be overwhelmed by their platform, right? If not, you can detect a certain flatness of character. And I don't mean to generalize, but you discern these things. You look at these things. And that all gives you reason to believe that this particular monastery on the side of the road, per se, this particular way of doing things, there's reasons to commit to that, not because you hope for the people in attentionalism to fail, not because you're hoping that one day you'll be confirmed, but because you have reason to believe that is the case based on what you've discerned and because of the joy and beauty you've had in the alternative. So that's why you commit to it, not because you have a notion of I want to be a martyr or I want them to fail, but because you have discerned in those subtle dynamics the alternative. You have to make a choice. You have to make your leap of faith for something. You make it here, and if in the end the attentionalist economy eclipses it or the nuke goes off, so be it. One sets themselves on the path by the joy before them. I just to make that point.
I think, Tim, at the end when you said squeeze too tightly, I think that sort of hits the nail on the head for me. How open and accepting and in touch is an individual with the rage inside themselves, that is, with the full extent of anger inside themselves, that would continue to be stoked in an interaction where you are challenging someone, especially if that someone is an unknown quantity, or they're pushing back, and it goes on and it goes on, and you continue to assert yourself. Like, often what's happening is people start to respond from a position of avoiding the chain of events that will lead to their anger being increased inside, because we have a fear of our anger, if we're going to put it in simple terms. We have fear of what we might be capable of if it gets too big inside us. There is a fear to look at our aggressive impulses, is how it seems to come down to me in a simple form. There is a fear we will squeeze too tightly. This is actually, in a roundabout way, often motivating either moving too quickly in these interactions and trying to just quickly force it, right? Not slowing down and paying attention to the nuance, becoming sort of cold and detached in our attempt to do this thing that we might still truly believe is in the best interest of the group. But if we don't bring love and care into it, if we can't, this is where being able to hold mixed feelings is so important, and not prioritizing one over the other, right? So yes, there is going to be there's going to be a level of irritation and frustration when we have a different viewpoint, and we're trying to introduce something new into something that's existing. there will be, because that is also the same signal that is usually letting us know we want to introduce this thing. I don't want to just leave it as is. Something's wrong here, or something might need adjusting, or I have something new to offer. That's the same signal, but we have to be able to navigate that feeling by also holding on to the positive feelings, is what we'd call them. The love, the care, we bring this into the relationship in the hopes of the possibility of greater connection, whatever it is. We don't bring it up to well, I was going to say we don't bring it up to destruct, but I'm trying to get back to the root of what your question was, Tim. I was thinking about maybe this will tie in. I was thinking about what you were saying, Daniel, about changing the social imagination, and there's some link here between just what I see as the erroneous manner in which anxiety is understood, and emotional maturity for me. Okay, helping to facilitate emotional maturity is a shifting of one's relationship to anxiety, to the emotional cues that sit underneath, to understanding how we can hold multiple emotions at once and use that in the service of connection within relationship. I don't know how we go about, I guess my mind goes to, I don't know how we go about trying to ensure that for example, that our elected leaders are emotionally mature in that sense, because of that misunderstanding that is out there. So this leads back to the changing the social imagination, because people want comfort now in this very moment. People want right in this moment of interaction. They want to feel at ease. They see anxiety as a scary thing. We're being taught everywhere that it's something to get rid of, and we have to take medication or do your breathing exercises or go here or do this or that. Don't feel anxious. If you're in a relationship and you feel anxious, that's I don't know, abusive, coercive, like there's all these, that person must be a narcissist. Now, like the whole way we interact with anxiety for me is the problem here, because if you can peek underneath it and really reacquaint yourself with some of these emotional signals that are causing the anxiety, such as the anger, you might see it's not so scary, and actually you can tolerate it inside, and then you can be free in a relationship. You can be free in a relationship to not be completely overwhelmed and overrun by the cognitive distortions, the dissociation, the physical complaints, the crippling physiology of anxiety. It just gets in the way of everything. It clouds everything. I feel like, though, now I'm going back to the same talking points and I've lost the thread of what you're actually asking, Tim.
Well, I would just jump in and say that I completely agree with what you're saying, because basically anxiety, to say something very gigantuous, basically in the 1850s, when society became conscious of itself as a thing, society became a thing, sociology was birthed. You also had basically the birth of emotions like boredom. These are giant claims, but Patricia Sachs on the history of boredom. Anxiety actually emerges as an emotional state very unique from what we've seen, because people begin feeling a certain, reality is not given. Right? There's a fragility to things. Basically, in the 1850s, and I also like to talk about Tocqueville. We've talked about it before. Basically, the anxiety of being social and relating to humans face to face. When you add diversity, we could do it when people were similar. If I knew you were a Christian and white and so on and so forth, but when you added global pluralism, you added the Great Enrichment with the Dutch Empire, et cetera, so forth. Basically, in the 1850s. The anxiety of being human of socially relating was so hard that we outsourced it to the logic of capital and economics. And capital has basically mediated our social relationships for us because we have not been able to face anxiety, to put it that way. It's exactly right. And then, as Mikey Downs has said, and he's completely correct based on Nick Land, is that basically AI is the continuation of the outsourcing of relationships to capital. The logic of capital is AI. And that is basically what we're going. And what Todd was saying is exactly right. So what you're seeing in people basically like, we're just going to choose AI versus human beings, that's been what we've been doing since the 1850s. Basically, we have not answered the call of learning how to be social across difference, because social across diversity creates anxiety versus simply nervousness. You get nervousness when you interact with other Christians and you don't know what to say. There's a nervousness. Anxiety is introduced once you bring in massive global pluralism and you realize I could have been born Hindu. So nervousness moves to an anxiety when it becomes existential, when people come to really realize the radicalness of difference, which makes their own existential standing more precarious, and that is then simulated or followed or seen in the sociological economic conditions, as Tim was saying, and it's all isomorphic down the chart. And if we don't learn to deal with anxiety, then yeah, there's really very little hope of our leaders having the emotional maturity needed for these massive questions. So I think that was a beautiful framing, Aspasia.
Yeah, because the stakes increase, right? Like with this change, the stakes increase in terms of, the risk that we take that we are going to be humiliated or abandoned or hurt or whatever it is, shamed for our honesty, for our right, it increases as difference increases. Yeah. 100%. And I think that is probably the part in a therapeutic context that is the beautiful. There is the what was it, the true and the good and the beautiful. In the therapeutic process that I do, I mean, I guess there is the true is really around the fleshing out the logical error that they are making, like these assumptions that they're making about I'm anxious because, like, we're actually trying to help them see the logical error that they're making. And then there is, obviously I guess the reference to the good is helping them to understand the cost of the current way of functioning, like the cost of all these defenses, the suffering that they come in with, right, is really being brought about by their own doing. They just don't see that. And so I guess the possibility of the good is if we can undo that structure and see what sits underneath it, you may get a different experience. But the beautiful is what makes this therapy process so beautiful. It's I guess it's once you get down to the real pressure, it's what are you going to do about it? We make it crystal clear what the decision is, and then we hand it to the client. I don't do it for them. It's the call for them. What are you going to do about it? And I am here. I am here in service of that. Like, it's the sitting with the person. It's the not. It's the and their, I guess, their choice to finally confront the thing inside in my presence. Often too, when the thing that they are confronting is a feeling towards me that might be a feeling that wants to kill me, right? That we could sit there as two people and just do that together. And actually what comes about on the other side of it is all the anxiety disappears. There is this incredible moment of connection, and it's beautiful. And it usually reduces people to tears. And it's only through the experiencing of that people can truly understand the premise of this whole thing. There's a lot in there, but there is a handing over to the other person that has to be their choice. I know, Tim, I haven't really answered your question because I've kind of lost the thread.
Well, yeah, there's a few things. I mean, I think it was more than valuable, the direction that took, and it's certainly like deeply interwoven with what was being asked. I mean, so perhaps the piece can be illuminated this way, because it sounds to me like you're articulating a very acute process, i.e. this is understood in terms of a therapeutic relationship with a person, not their whole context, in terms of the embodiment of that context. Obviously, you're welcoming in them to share that context, but there's, in a certain sense, they've maybe traveled to meet you. Maybe they had to, you speak mythologically, kind of leave their town and travel for several days to have this interaction, but they're going back to their town and you're not necessarily coming with them to that town. And that town still has a whole bunch of dynamics associated, which, you know, over time might produce the kind of anxiety which was maybe released or not, right? But the point is that there remains a societal context in which, as Daniel's articulating, various givens are not present in ways which, for a well-functioning, collectively mediating, more participatory culture, could help to navigate. And so questions around the following, as Daniel's sort of articulating, you know, God becoming capital, capital becoming AI, and our relational processes of mediating with each other being, in a sense, kind of like unconsciously shaped by these big, I don't know if I'm going to use the right language here, I'm not trying to use it technically, but almost like big symbolic, or perhaps better, big medium changes in terms of what's conditioning and shaping how we relate to our anxiety. One can think of times where myth around whether the invader or the wrathful god in the context of ritual, and there's different ways to understand ritual and its role in terms of releasing energy, and you have Girard and scapegoating and all this type of stuff, different sorts of ways we could frame this, but that there are kind of mythologically grounded, given ways of mediating the anxiety for individuals and collectives. The argument goes, as Daniel's making it, spoken to Goodell about this too, in terms of the God becoming capital, capital becoming AI, is, I think, some very, you know, interesting links there. The question then becomes, for me, if I raise something else which I am in somewhat of difference as a kind of tension with, is the too quick movement, perhaps aligned with how Daniel's articulating the difference between scale and spread. If one is moving too quickly into generating the new myth, the new story that can scale the influence we want, that's never sat right with me. Stories alone aren't going to do it. There's terms that I know you guys have been using in conversation with Seth, authentic resonance. Now, I'm not sure precisely how you're meaning that, but that term's coming to mind in the context of how I've explored some of these dynamics in terms of how can we trust the signal of story when anyone can just tell a story. Now, propositionally, of course, anyone can tell a story, but the thing is, text, of course, doesn't even require an authentic resonance through the voice to present it. And so in principle, AI, and as Anderson in the last podcast, as a fantasy author himself is saying, is that he's been shocked by how good the AI is at writing epic fantasy. And he wasn't expecting that, right? So that's a very interesting signal. I tried to give some potential argument of response along the relational lines to this, but there'd be much more to say there. But the point is that the mediation of text alone may not be as trustworthy a conveyor of the kind of authentic resonance as to the kind of map or invitation toward reintegrating back with tribe after leaving the therapist in this example, re-participating back in the context of culture. Now, I'm not saying we don't need stories, but part of, I think, the difference in where we've been coming from over these years is not to jump into attempting to come up with the new narrative and story, But it's like, how can we cultivate the context of participation that can illuminate the qualities of story and in a sense kind of locate, how can we locate ourselves in story, perhaps something closer to that, rather than how can we come about and design some story and tell a story in that way. This myth to God, to capital, to AI, rather than naively going back into, we just need to get the story right so we can all bind together and alleviate our anxiety. And of course, people will make the arguments all over the place. I remember doing so myself as an undergraduate in a seminar in an international relations class. Well, maybe we do need the aliens, right, to form that context of other that we can all bind around. And that seems to be as far as that particular, I don't know, discursive thinking approach can go. Because you can kind of see how that could work in a way. You could get some binding of it because it's a repetition of what's already happened before without, I think, properly reckoning with what might have changed in the context of evolution and the moments we're finding ourselves in. And so, yes, it is a very wild challenge, because where I am at with a lot of this stuff is that it's understandable to me that anxiety returns. I am not, as we often discuss in the Voicecraft context, there's an attitude towards gurus in a more traditional sense of those, like, for sure with the answers, or maybe so realized in their presence that there they are, just go back and reharmonize. Now, to a certain degree, when we return to the right kind of relational context, and we're actually talking about a kind of reorientation as a release, and we are talking about a kind of maybe reharmonization. But the mode of participation and how that participation can be understood as a cultural process, yes, with story to illuminate that. But there's also, it's also something other. It's not just go back and re-listen to the myth, go situate yourself in a now stabilized context. The kind of emotional maturity that is being sought here does seem to lead to an increase of responsibility to actually relate with a broader ecology that fractally is kind of undergoing the same kind of process of mediating its own anxiety. We began by speaking about how difficult it is to bring forward or make space for the unconscious. What is it to even relate with that when so many contexts are keeping that away for good reason, as Daniel argued? So circling around that, as I've just been doing, somewhere in there, I think, speaks to some of why it's so difficult to articulate in the ways people are used to the actual structural invitation of what it is to engage with what we're speaking about, and why the easiest way to kind of do that, as I have done in other contexts, is basically just to point to a very, time-honored wisdom of attending to one's relational context. And in that complexity practitioner sense, a la Nora Bateson and what have you, there is a simplicity to tending to the vitality in our relations, which is an important compass here. I don't think that is sufficient to properly relate with some of the inter-systemic, inter-collective anxiety mediating processes that condition the possibility to tend to the vitality in one's contextual relations. And this is one of the things I'd love to speak to Nora about, because it speaks to some of the real juice here. And the final thing I'll say now, where, I mentioned sort of field reports earlier, and this isn't quite that. It's just a presence that part of what I see happening are a whole bunch of unsayable ways in which different actors across different networks and contexts are in fact showing up very much in service of their more local contextual approach to the cultivation of value, in a sense, as they should be, but in such a way that conditions the possibility for what can be spoken in the transcontextual context in ways which I personally want to slow down with a bit more, because there's quite a lot that is passing through in that unspeakable, and I'm interested in what kind of constraints could be modulated in that context, and whether or not there is just what kind of bypassings, what kind of too quick affirmations of this direction we can all take as that kind of jumping too quickly to the emotional maturity of responding to the question, to link that back in, that kind of too quick approach to let's walk forward as martyrs or those with the right solutions because things are so urgent. And I know people are always working with these tensions, but there's just something so interesting about what mediates whether or not we can be and stay with the question.
Yeah, the only bit I can offer there, which again is going to be small compared to this wider question you're asking, is that, that person has that experience in therapy, they go back to they're back off to their village, whatever, right? That person, if they are, this is all about an honesty inside oneself as well. If they are more able and clearer inside themselves to notice honestly, without overwhelming, distorting anxiety, the emotional responses they're having in real time with people in their village that they go back to, and if it's without the anxiety and defenses, they are therefore just more able to be with those things, but not necessarily act from them. So it actually opens up more choice, but they are able to give another person an experience of inviting honesty from someone, or inviting them into some form of conversation, or even just in natural everyday interactions. This person is now less likely to act in a disconnecting, rejecting way when someone else in the village happens to slip something out honestly, right? They give the other person an experience of what it's like to interact with someone who can hold their full emotional response inside. They can notice, the other person has no idea, but this person might just be able to notice the part of them that would like to reach out and strangle this person right now right? But also the part of them that would like to reach out and hug this person right now. And also they can just notice all that, and they're not scared of that. They don't find that frightening. They don't see that as a marker that they're some secret murderer, or that they have some, or that they must, they understand all that differently inside themselves, and they don't get confused by that. And so therefore there is more clarity about, what am I going to do here? They can give the other person an experience of what that's like to interact with someone who, for the first time ever in this whole village, they may have ever been able to talk to someone who doesn't just say to them, you can't possibly say that, or, that makes you a bad person, or what, it doesn't shut them down, doesn't shame them, doesn't demonize them, doesn't go and betray them by gossiping about them, doesn't do all these things. And then, I guess the idea, it's a slow process, right? Is it's like a little light that can, like this could potentially catch on, that people have to have the experience, because this, again, going back just to my little therapy world, this starts from, attachment relationships. This starts from never really having had that proper experience of learning about all of that inside ourselves. It gets shut off too early by our caregivers, all these things. And then we go into society at large, which does the same thing. So that's all I can say about that, is that there is a manner in which this is not just about going to therapy for some sort of self-indulgent moment of release and then off you go back into the real world and everything just goes back to normal. It's a deeper structural change than that in a person that then gives them the capability to be with their emotions in a more mature way that allows then they're opening up to and accepting of another person, which in turn can give that person a new experience of what it's like to just say something a bit more honestly than they might normally. And it can catch on. There was something else I was going to say there about where you got to at the end. I can't even remember where you got to at the end. So I might just pass it to Daniel, and if it comes back to me, I'll let you know. My mind's gone.
Well, I really appreciate everything that has been shared. I think what Aspasia was saying there is very important. And also, it should be noted on the idea of a news story that will spread things. Well, you could argue Christianity only spread because they stayed to take care of people sick at the plague, right? Like there are actions and there are certain attentiveness of care that no story replaces. Like if it's not backed by certain actions, it doesn't spread. Like a story alone does not spread unless there are people staying during the plague who are going to die, taking care of the downtrodden, which then everyone, of course, during the plague was like, well, they must really believe their God came back from the dead then if they're willing to stay around and die taking care of people with the plague. So it's always important to realize that a quote unquote new story requires action. But notice this action. It's very small. It's not storming the Capitol. It's not taking over government. It's taking care of people on the plague, knowing they'll die. I mean, they're going to die and people may never see, right? And yet that's the sort of thing that has a big impact. However, there were a lot of things that Tim was pointing to, in addition to this question of the small with the structural, that is very important. Before I forget, a key characteristic as just a practical guide, an indication that there is something unconscious that needs to be brought to conscious or could be in the right time is, Michelle and I call it the eggshell phenomenon. Another term for it is if you're in a minefield environment. When you feel there are certain things you can't say or a bomb goes off when you're a work environment, that is a key emotional experience that there is something spiritually off or something unconscious that is bad. And if you note that, as to make a very large claim, it is probably the case that the majority of people on planet Earth find themselves living basically their entire life in that kind of atmosphere, in that kind of environment. And they don't have any idea that there's a possibility of living another way. They've not seen it modeled. They don't know about the skills of conversation, the therapy, the voicecraft, and different things. And their lives are that quiet desperation, as some authors have put it. And they just think that minefields is just the objective way of reality. But it is not. And if we as the human race do not get better at showing the alternative, we should not be surprised if human beings pick AI. I think also on this question of scale, a way to look at it is utility always wins scale, but in terms of spread, good, true, and beauty win. When you had a change in truth, culturally, that spread. Then you had a change in good, and I'd have to elaborate all this, granted for me. You can't win the game of scale. Utility always wins scale. Another way to look at this is quantity always wins the game. Quantification always wins the game of scale, but qualification wins the game of spread. Unfortunately, people lose faith in the game of spread because they can't quantify it, and so they do the quantifiable, and scale wins. Basically, all roads of quantification lead to AI. The game of spread is the true, the good, and the beautiful, and the argument is the following. We've basically exhausted the potential to spread on terms of truth. We've exhausted the potential of spreading on terms of good. Now we have to attempt spreading in terms of beauty. And I think Aspasia put this very well. There is something about beauty where you say, we could do this together. We could do this together. This is a very important phrase. I really like it. Because when you learn that there are certain things that you can do with other human beings that amaze you, we could do this together. Well, then you start saying there's reason to deal with the difficulty of human, to not give in to the temptation of third impact from Neon Genesis, to actually deal with the difference of bodies and work through the art of unveiling, because there is something we can do together that when we experience, it's beautiful. And now you know experiences of beauty are possible in reality. And if this is possible in reality, and if it's possible here, how else might it be possible? Where else might it be possible? And to what quality might it be possible? Beauty is fundamentally relational, and beauty as a relational quality is brought out in diversity. But diversity also makes it harder, and therefore we are more tempted to avoid it or to not engage in it. I think it's just very also important to what we were saying, like, if there is not a certain experience that is afforded in human relation that makes you go, it's worth it, then it is a matter of probability that pain will eventually occur in relationships, that will eventually occur in the relationship, pain. It is therefore probable everyone will have that experience and therefore side on AI and away from human relation because because they don't ever experience the alternative, right? So probability simply has on a trajectory on the just way of human relation that we're going to move away from relating to human beings unless we learn to have certain experiences with human beings that make us go, look at what we can do together. If we can have those experiences, then when we experience the pain of human relationship, we will not automatically respond to that by moving away from relation. We'll remember the beauty we've had. And in fact, maybe the pain actually affords us capacities that make us have more beauty than we could have had because we've learned something in that pain. And it starts to work in a feedback loop that makes us more and more human. I think also on the structural issue. So to say something very large, a lot of our problems simply rest because you also obviously have the dark triad coming into the top of the system, et cetera, so forth. So I am strongly of the opinion that much rests upon the metaphoric framing by which people experience information and phenomenon by which they look to process it, which then determines the trajectory that phenomenon is on, which will either afford the possibility of humanity or not. And what I mean by that is basically people go to school, and the metaphor of the classroom as medium is that your response to information is to look for a right answer. And you carry that with you your entire life. That alone, that metaphoric association of coming to experience information and phenomenon as that of which has a right answer, single-handedly makes us then associate conversation with that where we're not exploring together, but we're looking to be right and not to be wrong, and therefore we're scared, and therefore we're anxious, and we're not going somewhere together. Somebody has the answer, somebody is the big other, and I want to appeal to them, and that creates the inability to actually face anxiety as an invitation to explorations of the human condition that can afford a beauty that otherwise is not possible. There are no right answers. There is an exploration. But if the classroom for 12 years and beyond basically makes you associate life with a process of finding the right answers and having the right answers or getting a bad grade and being less status and not having much success, you carry that metaphoric association to everything. And by definition, what is going to get the majority, if life is about the right answer, then life is about the quantifiable. The qualitative is out by definition. Therefore, what will scale is utility, that of which increases efficiency, that of which can be quantified, that of which is, and guess what is hard to quantify? The human. So the more we can reduce human dimensionality and flatten it, the more we'll make humans real. And therefore, we will get the right answer because we will have more things that are quantifiable. And that then collectively shuts people off from when somebody returns who have gone through the therapeutic process and had more of a qualitative change. They are possibly less receptive to it because they are stuck in a certain framework of going, well, that was the answer for you. Is it the answer for me? And also, that's just subjective. That's just your personality. It's not real. Qualitative changes in relationships, if they can't be quantified, are that of which are then atomized and not something that you can participate in. So if you start people in a metaphoric complex that makes them relate to the world as not an exploration, but that of which is either right or wrong, then that association collectively results in an inability to spread the things that we are describing. A few more things that then have to be expanded upon. Basically, the way the name of the game is not, in my opinion, to find a better story and give it to people. It is to increase the ease by which people can have surprising encounters with otherness that shakes them out of the eminent frame by which they capture reality that they then have to respond to, and over again give them those tests. That's the social coordination mechanism. You're not telling people the right story. You're providing them a constant qualitative experience of encountering otherness that opens them up to possibility versus them be captured in a single narrow line of way of thinking, right? It's like, why does the market work? The market works because it is a constant experimentation of different products and ideas based on people trying this. Like, it's a constant feedback loop of trying to determine what products are good and what they're not. It's a perpetual experiment, right? Now, of course, it gets captured by various corporate, etc. It gets captured, of course. But the idea is that it's this constant experimentation, right? And from that experimentation, you begin determining what works, what doesn't, and you have a competition, right? Well, similarly, what you have to do is create a means of social coordination by which people can encounter other modes of being, other ways of being, to test them and see what ways of talking, what works. How do I make the unconscious conscious this way? Oh, that didn't work here. Let me try it again here. You're creating a new context that is extremely fluid by which people can regularly practice these different skills and encounter diversity more and more, to where they can learn that it is a constant process that they are engaged with, but that is infrastructural, which again, I strongly believe this technology that we are using now that combines Zoom, YouTube, and all the ways that we are meeting is in fact a technology that allows this sort of social coordination where people can be experimenting, encountering things, which is a mechanism by which you can spread a quality of experience that makes people open to emotion and a deeper self, not a story telling them that if they don't do it, we're all going to die. No one thinks they don't have deep emotional capacity. No one thinks they can't handle difficulty. No one thinks that they're afraid to open up. Nobody thinks they're not vulnerable. Nobody thinks that they shut down loved ones. The problem is that our brains are the frenemies. They do a very good job of never letting us actually encounter the reality of what we do. And if there is not and so just simply telling a story to people, don't do that, is simply they go, yes, I won't, and don't change. You have to create a new means of experience, a new ways of encounter that gradually and slow them, open them up to the truth of themselves, so that then they may have that experience one day where they say, look what we did together. Look what we can do. And if you can increase the probability that the average person one day says, look what we can do, then you have begun the process of spreading an address that can deal with the problem of the fact that we do not belong. But that work has to start one person at a time, and it has to be done daily.
Beautifully said, Daniel. Thank you very much. Now, Aspasia, unless you have anything you'd like to add, then I think it would be a nice place to bring this to a close.
Can I say something?
Yeah, mate, absolutely. I'm gonna close it there for the podcast, but we can stick around. We can continue on. Otherwise, it'd be like, who's this? We haven't even introduced him. Do you know what I mean? We'll leave it in for the network. How about that? We do it a second. Was this guy here the whole time? Fuck.
Yeah. Whoa, man. It's an apparition.
I quite like that. It's the surprise that we were talking about.
It is the surprise encounter.
This is a guy in a van. He's somewhere. We don't know where he is. He's in a van.
It's the voice of God.
It's perfect. It's perfect. Okay, it's good to see you, sir. I hope you're doing well.
I think it would almost be more interesting if I put my camera around, because it's like probably more interesting. Yeah, I've got this like beautiful view.
Wow,
It's beautiful.
Over
That's
in the
Australia
bush.
right there.
Oh, wow.
Daniel.
Oh, yeah, I said the
Australia.
beach. I thought it was sand. It's just that.
Oh yeah, Daniel. That is
Just
Australia.
the red dot.
Oh, he's a real one.
Yeah, it was a joy to listen to all of that. I feel like a lot of those themes have been really alive for me in the last week, especially listening to a podcast with you recently, Aspasia, and you made this point about like in talking, having the talking be a process of exploring the point that we're trying to find or make, as opposed to like the inverse of that, which is probably having the point already formulated and then engaging in the discussion that way. I don't know. I just found that to be like a very nice new idea for me. So I kind of want to fuck with that right now. I mean, geez, I was like 30 minutes late to the conversation, so I guess I can only go what I heard from when I started. But I just kind of, everything that was talked about really was kind of embodied for me in this experience I had on Sunday, where I went to what is virtually like, I guess, a protest in the inner city of Melbourne in this area called Camp Sovereignty. And it was a musical event that was, you know, in advocacy of what's happening in Palestine, and also like within Australia with Indigenous acknowledgement of land and people and so on and so forth. And I went with some friends and my partner. And so there's this kind of like shared connection we have with, you know, what we believe to be a good way forward for things, like a resolution towards certain things. But anyway, the music and the artists that were performing were kind of like integral to the message, or at least like representing, I think, what the people stood for at this event. The general kind of like feeling in the air. And there was a lot of it where I was just like, this is stupid, you know, like the message that these people are putting across. And one of them was basically like an artist. And I guess this is kind of like the nuance of music, right? Like as someone who's made music and loves listening to music and loves like the nuance and poetry in music and the, you know, the oxymorons that are supposed to reflect like the deeper complexities of what's happening. This one artist, like I think the lyric was verbatim, like "kill all billionaires and fuck Israel," and I was just kind of like, I know really strong like thing in my gut, in my heart, like just somewhere in like the heart center, where I was just this really strong aversion and kind of like, I don't know, almost like disgust at the reaction of both the crowd and like the artist being sort of, I guess, I don't know, spurred on by what the lyrics were talking about. And again, it's like music. I kind of wonder if I was taking things too literally here, but I don't know. I kind of found myself in this really deep tension with my friends, my partner, and my perspective. And I was trying to, I guess, to sort of like grab from what you were saying before, Aspasia and Daniel, this kind of like tension of noticing my disagreement with what was going on in the moment, but trying to sort of like hold like steadfast and just continue to move through that discomfort. But anyway, the last week's been kind of riddled with this really deep turmoil and sort of tumultuous, I don't know, kind of like confluence of energies, I guess. But yeah, I don't know. It's really interesting to hear. It's really timely to hear all of this from you guys, because these things feel really alive for me right now, where there does seem to be, and I guess like Daniel, you mentioned something with Arendt, you know, and she's my favorite philosopher out of all the ones that I've engaged with so far. And I was listening to this lecture recently, which is a kind of a, I don't know, it's a sort of a liberal arts college somewhere in the Northeast in the US. This guy is kind of delivering this 24-part course on the origins of totalitarianism. And one of the salient points he's making is that like Arendt is stressing that to live in a political society is to engage in like discussion, is to like talk about these things. And it's this kind of like evolution. I don't know if like a dialectic is the right way of phrasing it, but it's this kind of sense of like, this is what I think, this is what you think. Let's like, you know, wrestle with that and see what emerges from that. And you know, maybe we can share this experience of going through living together in a society where we disagree on shit, but like we don't just go like, yeah, fuck Israel, man, and fucking kill billionaires. And it's like this really, I guess, this violence that's like imbued in the message. And as well, like the tension of noticing myself being really like energized in the fervor of the moment and in the passion of the moment, and almost kind of wanting to be like shout myself like, yeah, fuck Israel and kill all billionaires, almost kind of in the way that like, I don't know, moderate Germans expressed this kind of really strange impulse to want to do the Hitler salute, even though they were like, this guy's a lunatic. And yeah, I don't know, I guess the sort of the difficulty of, I guess, feeling like being a moderate is kind of, it's really difficult to be like, hey, guys, like I deeply empathize with what's going on here and understand that we need to perhaps like, you know, talk about these issues and find ways that we can address them without then being attacked by either side, left or right or what have you. I don't even know.
Well, you know what, Kai? Like, rather than moderate, I think actually like a better reframe that we need to get to is like, that's actually being really radical.
Yeah.
That's the thing. It's that, you know, it's not that. It's like radical in the shallow scapegoating repetition of all that shit sense that they're speaking from. Anyway, it would be great if you could say some of that stuff on the 8th, because that's when the next Voicecraft local event's going to be at a pub on Thursday evening. So it'd be great if you could come along, because expressing that perspective is super important. I'm still trying to get the framing right, as we were discussing before you came along, but
it's the being commanded as well too, though, right? Like it's a command, essentially, what they're yelling. I mean, even if you put the aggressive, violent nature of the content aside, they're just yelling at you to do something, or like it's go, Daniel. There's so much I could say.
Well,
Mm.
just to say a few quick things.
I might need to go soon as well, to be honest.
I should as well.
I actually, so Daniel, can we try, unless you want to stay for quite a bit longer, why don't we try and literally do it in like one to 2 minutes? Because I do have to go.
Sure. No problem. And I've really enjoyed, so it worked out. I will just say very quickly, moderation as the new radical is hot. Second, I would basically, if you did have to pick one philosopher this is a huge claim, for the 21st century to think our moment, it is Hannah Arendt. Like if you had to choose one, Hannah Arendt might be the one, with the origins of totalitarian, all the different work that is extremely important. Basically, what she is saying about politics is what I like to say with Tocqueville on democracy, which basically, in my opinion, Voicecraft is training the capacity to actually have a political space in global pluralism and democracy. If you cannot do that, then the logic of capital, ergo AI, utility, quantification wins. That's the end of the game. And what ends up happening is when you lose the capacity for the politics, what Edmund Burke basically says is that the sublime, or what he means by that, is depth drive. Depth drive takes over, and that's what you're seeing. Politics has simply become a sort of emotional explosion of emoting particular size, and it's a certain release that people are looking at, because the sublime for Burke is a kind of cathartic sexual sort of release that people have that comes out in a certain aggression. And basically, to tie it to what Aspasia said, and then I'll stop, is if individuals don't deal with the problem of anger comes out in the mob or the mass, which are different in belonging again, but it comes out in that, which is a release of the subliminal that isn't sublated into the individual through learning the political. And once that occurs, the political simply becomes basically a sort of sexual hunger that people have that is going to lead to basically destruction. And it will call itself politics, but basically it is just the unleash of the death drive, which will destroy us all. And so the stakes are very high.
100%. 100%.
This has been fun.
This has been fun, and thank you for sharing that story, Kai. That was I can
thank you for being
relate
here,
to what
Kai.
you would have been feeling in that moment.
Thank you to you as well, Aspasia and Daniel, and helping me through that. I think that would work as a great podcast, just straight up.